Bob, you can probably start talking now if you.
All right, just waiting for the cue. Welcome, everybody. This is our annual education summit, and we're focusing this year on the resegregation of America's schools, pursuing a more equal education. A couple of, well, actually almost a year ago, Jerry Hawkins from the Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation Group and I were talking about schools and equity. And we've been talking about these things for a while. Many of us on this phone call have been talking about these issues for some time. And I think what's interesting is that over the last couple of months, there's been so much more attention put on this idea of racial equity. And so we're excited to be able to talk about our schools and the levels of equity in our schools. And so Children at Risk, which is in Texas, along with the Texas Family Leadership Council, Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation, our friends at Prairie View are happy to bring this along with the sponsorship by Shell. So here are a couple little rules, which the staff, and I want to thank Jessica Brundage, who did the bulk of all the work on this. Always keep yourself muted and your video turned off. Make sure that if you have any questions, you chat with someone on the chat box with host or staff and their title. Adjust your screen view to speaker view. That way you're going to get just the speaker for those of you that aren't familiar with Zoom at this point. And set your video settings in the settings tab to hide non-video participants. We'll try to help you out as well. Our hosts are also controlling a lot of this. Let's go to the next slide. Children at Risk, for those of you who don't know, is a Texas-based group. We focus on advocacy and research, passing a lot of legislation at the Texas level. We have a lot of connections, of course, nationally, and we hope to talk about this resegregation of America's schools in a national context. And then our Family Leadership Council is made up of numbers of nonprofits from all across the state of Texas that are focused on children and young families, and how do we make sure that we pass Texas policies to make sure that there's success within all of those groups. And of course, special thanks to Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation, Prairie View, and all of our partners that are helping us make this work today, and including the Texas Racial Equity Collaborative, which has worked really hard to make sure that this goes. All right, let's talk a couple, and of course, Shell. We couldn't do this without Shell, and our good buddy, Fraser Wilson will be joining us right at the end to say a few remarks as well on behalf of Shell. Let's talk a little bit about the status of school resegregation in America, and then we'll go quickly to our friend Gary Orfield from the UCLA Civil Rights Project. I think the important thing to note on this is that part of resegregation is a severe inequity in funding. And so one of the things we see all across America is this idea that schools are not funded equally, leading to continuing resegregation. I thought this piece of data was really interesting, that the number of schools that are 1% or less, where 1% or less of the student body is white, has more than doubled in the last 20 years. So an interesting piece of data. I think also, as we go to the next slide, one of the things that stood out here is that while we see a lot of Americans, the majority of Americans, see that this is a problem. I wonder why it's not higher with the 57 and 53%, but 80% of parents across America understand that a racially diverse school is a better school for their child. And so we have 80% of parents saying, hey, this is not right. Something needs to change as we move forward. When we look across cities, where we see a lot of inequity between whites and students of colors. Of the top 10 cities in America, 4 of those are here in Texas: Austin, Dallas, Houston, and Fort Worth. And especially when you look at places, Austin prides itself on its great schools, still a lot of disparity there. Houston, the most diverse city in America, yet still we have this resegregation in our schools. That's tremendous. So a lot of problems as we move forward around resegregation. Let's go to the next slide. one of the things that we see around racially integrated schools is that one is that peer learning really works. So we understand that, but also fewer disparities in math and reading scores, lower dropout rates. Students who attend these racially integrated schools just have more positive views of students of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and certainly less implicit bias. So we see a lot of positives, and we're really skimming through this, but there are a lot of positives in regards to this, as most parents would understand. Next topic, we want to talk a little bit about segregation in the school to prison pipeline. And our buddies over at Texas Appleseed are here, Andrew Hairston and Madison Sloan. And Andrew, Madison, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to come present on this, which I know is a very important project for you guys and for all of us, really, right? So thank you very much, and take it away, guys.
Thank you for having us. This is
Thank you so much.
a big question for us. Next slide, please. So part of the question here, although I think it has been partially answered by previous panelists, is what does fair housing have to do with education justice? And segregation in any form, whether it's housing or schools, is not natural, it's not a choice, and it's not inevitable. Segregation is the product of deliberate governmental policy and decisions at the federal, state, and local level. So the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, was sort of the last and most difficult to pass of the civil rights laws of the 60s, doesn't merely bar discrimination, although it does that, but it requires governments to work towards dismantling segregation that they engineered and redress the harms it caused and continued to cause. And a small footnote here, there is currently a big federal attack on whether that obligation exists and how it can be dealt with. But it's in the law. So, and I want to also be really clear that when we talk about desegregation and integration, we don't mean people of color have to move or send their children to majority white neighborhoods and schools, which has been, I think, often a really terrible experience for those families and children. So what we mean when we talk about integration, dismantling segregation also means remedying historical disinvestment in schools and neighborhoods, in infrastructure. And we have taken a framework which was created by high school students in New York City who have an organization called Integrate NYC. And it's multiracial students from all socioeconomic classes working on integrating their schools. And so their model of integration is not necessarily just diversity. Part of it is racial, ethnic, and economic diversity, but also that leadership is representative of the diversity, that there are relationships across people of different backgrounds, that restorative justice is part of the model, and that resources and opportunities are shared equitably. Next slide, please. So on the left is one of the ways segregation was engineered. This is a federal government map, and it's one of the maps described as the, redlining. The government came in and said to banks, to everyone else, white neighborhoods, which are blue, are safe to invest in, and largely Black and integrated neighborhoods, which are in red, were not, which is one of the reasons for the wealth gap. But I think that the scary thing is if we look at a map of racial geography in Austin in 2000, it looks a lot like that 1934 redlining map. purple is African American, green is Latinx, and blue is white. So those patterns, did not change. And I'll note that part of the reason that even the redlining map looks like it does with those concentrations by race is that because in 1928, Austin passed a master plan which called for the creation of a Negro district, and the way the government of Austin forced people to move across what is now I-35 was by shutting down the schools that served Black and Latinx students and cutting off utilities. Next slide, please. And so racial segregation is still engineered by government policy. It's just gone underground, essentially. Something that was openly racist, like racially restrictive covenants, which said homes could only be sold to white people, is outlawed. But if you look at a map of land use restrictive covenants, so single family zoning, different types of exclusionary zoning, boy, does that overlay exactly on top of the areas where there were racially restrictive covenants. And again, that area of town is still extremely white. Slide 4, please. And this map is a little stretched out, and it's a map of where high-performing schools in Austin are according to income segregation. But unsurprisingly, income segregation essentially equates to racial segregation. And as you can see, the high-performing schools are in the whiter, wealthier areas of Austin. Next slide. So, segregated neighborhoods produce segregated schools. Schools reflect the demographic composition of their neighborhoods. And, I think in a very meaningful way, when people start talking about preferences for neighborhood schools, particularly white people, it's a preference for segregated schools. 62% of white Americans said it's better for children to go to a neighborhood school, even if it's not diverse. But that is not, only 68% of Black Americans prefer diverse schools over local schools. Next slide. School segregation also drives housing segregation. You start to see white flight, including in the suburbs where schools are about 20% students of color. The perception is that schools with high populations of students of color are low performing. But the ugly truth is that parents will choose a whiter school over one with higher test scores that is more diverse. This is, I think anyone who has bought a house has heard a lot about the good schools in that neighborhood, and that is really used to do racial steering. So real estate agents may tell, a white family that a house, a more integrated or neighborhood of color has poor schools, but they will tell home buyers of color that those schools are good. And the National Association of Realtors has actually recommended that realtors don't discuss the schools because it's so clear that talking about schools is essentially racial code. Next slide. And I will say that the first set of numbers on here actually comes from Gary Orfield's research. Thank you for that. This is in 2005. It has not, these numbers aren't significantly different. 1 in 6 Black students and 1 in 9 Latinx students went to schools that were at least 99% students of color. But I think you can see, so the pie chart on the right is the percentage of students that attend high poverty schools. 71% of Black students and 73% of Latinx students attend high poverty schools, and only 28% of white students do. this reflects another truth of segregation. Poorer white families live in higher opportunity neighborhoods than often middle class Black and Latinx families. Next slide. So Gary Orfield mentioned that segregation stopped essentially in 1974. So this is the case that did that. The Milliken v. Bradley. The case was originally filed against the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan over segregation of the Detroit schools. And the judge ordered an inter-district resegregation plan with what are essentially white flight counties outside Detroit. Detroit, as you probably know, is majority African American, and the sort of suburbs that ring it are white. The significance of 8 Mile Road is that that's where a bank told white homeowners they had to build a concrete wall to separate them from the Black neighborhood next door, or they could not get home loans. So, but what the judge's reasoning was really that governmental actions have created and perpetuated racial segregation, and that there are interactive effects of housing and school segregation. Next slide. So this case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturned the lower courts. And what the Supreme Court did here was essentially a sleight of hand. It ignored all the evidence that segregation was government engineered, and says, we don't, this is, segregation is a matter of choice, causes are unknowable. And that, again, unless you can show deliberate discrimination, current deliberate discrimination essentially by another school district, an inter-district remedy is impermissible. And again, this is the line of reasoning that led to Parents United, has overturned voluntary desegregation plans. And this is, again, sort of how structural racism works and affects things, is that, there's a myth that once segregation by law ends, segregation is suddenly a voluntary choice and doesn't take into account any of the disadvantage that has been imposed on neighborhoods of color or schools of color by generations of racism. Next slide. Why is housing segregation important? One of the co-sponsors of the Fair Housing Act said, where a family lives, where it is allowed to live, is inextricably bound up with better jobs, economic motivation, and good living conditions. And I think a lot of folks have talked about some of those effects, including health effects. Segregation makes it a lot easier to gerrymander school districts and attendance zones. But these effects are ongoing. And again, part of the solution has to be dealing with the impact of housing segregation and school segregation together. Turn that over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and to the Children at Risk team for this incredible conference. So I think the recurring theme between me and Maddie's work and all of our work at Texas Appleseed is the deliberate government action and inaction that has led to unnecessary suffering for so many people across the nation. And I think that barely is truer than when talking about the school to prison pipeline So folks are probably familiar with the school to prison pipeline at 30,000-foot view, but just for a grounding, it is, I think, the way that local, state, and federal governments over the past 30 to 40 years, certainly starting with the Nixon administration and its war on drugs, have adopted a zero tolerance approach to the way that young people are treated in their schools and their communities, and the ways that they are excluded from their classrooms for fairly routine, age-appropriate behavior in so many instances. I'm going to go to the next slide. Again, it's just that system that disproportionately targets Black and Latinx and other people of color, LGBTQ young people and kids with disabilities, and puts them into contact with the criminal legal system based on their school conduct. And it is certainly exacerbated by the presence of school police officers who have just proliferated in schools across the country over the past few decades. We can go to the next slide. And then, perfect. So school policing is really that bread and butter of our education justice work right now. I think that, as Maddie really eloquently explained, how housing and school segregation have led to these educational injustices for so many young people, there has been an ease to just introduce school policing into so many Black and Latinx schools and have that be a common experience for young people. And it's well documented at this point, the various abuses that young people have suffered at the hands of school police officers across the country. Regularly, young people will be charged with resisting arrest or assault of a police officer for anything that can be classified as willfully defiant, right? Talking back, going to the bathroom without a hall pass, right? Just having a bad day can lead to these criminal entanglements that are quite detrimental. We can go to the next slide. I think especially right now, grounding ourselves in the coronavirus pandemic, just recognizing that all of us on this call today, on this conference, and certainly the children in our lives have suffered such mass loss and trauma over the past 5 months from, again, this government malfeasance and unnecessary suffering brought on by it. I think the districts are going to have to be very deliberate as we talk about in this moment of revolutionary change, as folks are raising up to protest police violence in real time. We have to talk about the legacies of housing and school segregation and the school prison pipeline on generations of young people, and also talk about the pandemic and its impact on young people and school staffers, and have trauma-informed care be the thing that really guides policymaking in this academic year and years to come. We're very interested in the idea of a suspension ban, such as been proposed in Dallas ISD by a certain number of trustees. And we hope that districts will take on those really bold proposals and say the exclusionary discipline will not be a part of the experience of young people as they navigate the 2021 school year and subsequent ones. We'll get to the next slide. I just want to talk about all of this like within the context of the prison industrial complex. So, I think that as the government over the past several decades has, again, ensured the segregation of so many communities, so has it also expanded the carceral state to something that has not been seen in human history, right? Especially since 1980. And I think we really tried to ground our work across projects with the notion of prison industrial complex abolition, that truly police and security measures and surveillance don't keep communities and young people safe, that truly to dismantle the school to prison pipeline and to address the social ills that have persisted for centuries, there has to be an investment in communities and young people where they can thrive and feel like they are not subjected to the horrors of the carceral state. And we really tied the fight at Texas Appleseed for police-free schools, which we've been happy to support over the past year, to a broader calls for prison abolition, as we've registered the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, as we lift up Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. We feel like this has to be a necessary part of our work and the conversations that we're having. We can go to the next slide. Cool. Yeah. Before we go into questions, I just want to say that I'm so thankful again for this opportunity. And I think that Maddie has just so poignantly illustrated how housing and school segregation have contributed to the persistence of the school to prison pipeline. And I'd say because of the ways that schools have been set up in so many communities across Texas and across the nation, exclusionary discipline and policing have that much more easily become commonplace occurrences within the schools of Black and Latinx young people.
I have questions for both Andrew, both you and Madison, and I'll start with you. What is the easy answer that you give people? It seems like, as I've talked about this exact issue with people, the first, and maybe it's to sort of the general public, when they come back and they say, well, what do we do without a policeman in our school? You know, what happens when there's a school shooting? You know, that seems the first response, right? You probably hear this all the time. What is your response to that?
Yeah, if I may. So the Government Accountability Office released a report probably about 6 weeks ago to examine school shootings over the past 20 years. And there were a few takeaways, but namely it's that a lot of school shootings occur outside of the school building. And they knew that a number of school shootings and acts of mass violence occur in wealthier, wider schools and districts, right? And I think the reaction of policymakers over the past 21 years, certainly since Columbine especially, has been to examine Black and Latinx communities and schools and increase the number of school police officers within those districts and within those campuses. And yeah, the data consistently confirmed that Black and Latinx young people are not the ones shooting up schools in these acts of mass violence, right? So, you know, that's one point on the data piece. I think philosophically, right, going back to that notion of prison industrial complex abolition, there's never been a time where people of color, particularly Black people in this country, have been given the opportunity to be free and to thrive within their own communities. And so it's going to take a very deep commitment to attacking these structures of systemic racism and white supremacy to say that Black people don't need to be controlled, they don't need to be surveilled, and they can, if given the resources and left to their devices, can really flourish. It's a hard line to take, but I think quite necessary.
Yeah. I think in regards to the school police as well, the data is so overwhelming, right, that there's no need, and it's actually a damage to our children. Yet I run into school superintendents all the time, school superintendents of color that are like, oh no, we need to have our school resources. Yeah. So it's seemingly easy because of the data, but a lot of people are entrenched in this idea. I wanted to ask both of you, when we talk about school segregation and state and national policies, again, something I asked Gary right early on today, assuming we live in a climate where people want this to happen, what are some of the easy policies that we should be pursuing in the state and nationally around the integration of schools? Andrew and then Madison.
Well, I think a big one would be restoring the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is the obligation under the Fair Housing Act that requires local governments to take affirmative action to desegregate. It has essentially just been erased. But one of the things about it is, you know, the recognition that housing segregation is not just about housing. It's, you know, local governments have to look at what is its impact on other systems, schools, transportation, you know, this really holistic look at how segregation affects people. It would also be really helpful to preserve disparate impact. The theory that if there are just disproportionate harms, even if a policy is sort of facially neutral, that's a discrimination policy. And I think one of the things, those policies and actual federal enforcement, which is a whole nother question, is really force local governments or give them cover for supporting things like affordable housing in white neighborhoods, or I think Austin's superintendent has described redrawing attendance zones and school district boundaries as like essentially a third rail. We won't even think about that because white parents would get so upset. And what a lot of it is, this is connected to policy, and that our choices are defined by policy. But I think, to echo Andrew, there needs to be a lot of work on systemic racism and, frankly, on the choices that white parents make. Parents can choose to affirmatively desegregate, to send their kids to neighborhood schools, and then we deal with questions of, are they taking it over in their own image? But parents have choices about where they live and which schools their kids go to, whether they support affordable housing in their neighborhoods, whether they support neighborhood diversity and making the neighborhood a place everyone feels comfortable living.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting, Madison, how much of this policy is dictated by how we're going to make white parents angry, right? I mean, we see of this, and a lot of it gets back to those white parents always vote, and I think as we vote more, and especially we see this in Texas where people don't vote enough, right? It's clear. Andrew, as a brief final, because we only have like 30 seconds, do you have your response when we talk about policies that could really change?
Yeah, very much so. I wanted to point people to the chat from John Jackson. I really appreciate this. How much of maintaining school police is about maintaining the budget and personnel, especially in Dallas and Houston. You had tens of millions of dollars devoted to internal police departments in those districts, probably $24 million all told for Dallas ISD police and the administration of that department, then probably $10 million for Houston. And there are hundreds of internal school police departments across the state in this current iteration. And so I think that at this moment, as folks are contending with broader social movements against police violence and really grappling with how change can come about, I think that's a really important place to focus your energy within your local ISD to say, how much are we spending on our likely internal school police department? At least probably $1 million. That money needs to be divested from the school police department and placed into resources for mental health professionals, more school psychologists and school counselors, and restorative justice programs that will help young people and their families heal from the trauma of the coronavirus pandemic. Oh, $21 million in Houston. Thank you, Ms. Jones.
Very good. Andrew Hairston.
Fund school police, is my suggestion.
Very good. Thank you both very much. Andrew Hairston, Madison Sloan from Texas Appleseed. Thank you for the great work that you're doing. And I know there's a whole team at Children at Risk that is very interested in working with you guys on this. So we look forward to some possible partnerships. The work you're doing is extraordinary. Please give my best to Deborah. It's been a while since I've seen her, but thank you all for your work. Very good.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Look forward to working with you too.
All right, very good. All right, well, let's go. My buddy Jerry Hawkins is on the line. And Jerry is the head of the Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. And with him will be Dr. Crystal Laura from Chicago State University. First, Dr. Fraser Wilson, if you could video mute yourself, that would be very good. And then Jerry, how you been doing, man?
Doing all right. I'm doing all right. Hanging in there,
Absolutely. Very
Feeling
good.
kind of scratching my throat. So I just took a coronavirus test. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Let's see what happens. Exactly. Well, take care of yourself, and I'll turn it over to you, Crystal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Hi, Crystal. Hi, Dr. Laura.
Hi, how are you? Other than a little itchy at the throat.
I know. Very excited to be on here with Dr. Laura. Again, my name is Jerry Hawkins. I am the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, which is a 14-city initiative of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Our mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, through equitable policies and policies. Really excited to be here with my, what I call her, my sister, Dr. Laura, who is just a phenomenal scholar and really concerned about teachers, and just want to give her a brief introduction. Dr. Crystal Laura is a professor of educational leadership at Chicago State University, a writing coach to education change makers, and author of 3 books on critical issues in urban education, including Being Bad, My Baby Brother, and the School to Prison Pipeline. So I want to welcome Dr. Crystal Laura again. I have her book right here, so we're going to talk about it. But yeah, Dr. Crystal Laura, can you just briefly talk about your work, very specifically with teachers, and just highlight some of that racial equity work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to the folks who crafted this space and curated this space for us to have this difficult, very important conversation. Let me just, before I say anything more about me, just give all love to the folks who spoke before us and had a conversation about abolition. I popped into the meeting just at the moment when the previous presenters were talking about freedom and abolition and the prison industrial complex. And those conversations are few and far between, and so very urgent and important, particularly right now in this moment. So all love to those folks. As you mentioned, my day job is a professor, a tenured full professor of educational leadership at Chicago State University, which is a predominantly Black institution on the far south side of my hometown in Chicago. So much of that labor is really organized around working with administrators, particularly teacher leaders and principals who are on the road toward the superintendency, to really help them situate lenses of justice and liberation and equity at the forefront of all that they do. And that's always a really beautiful and challenging job to, work with folks who've been practitioners for 20 years and 30 years and introduce new lenses and new ways of looking at the world and doing their work. As you mentioned, my university labor kind of spins off in different directions. And part of that means that I do critical teacher development work. So I, bounce around the country and do workshops and speaking opportunities with folks who need some support with thinking about what it means to do their work from a place of equity, or what I like to talk about and use as a lens through which I do my work is how to do your work from a place of love toward justice with joy. I think those 3 components are absolutely essential. And if you try to do one, thank you. I'm a terrible, marketer. So thank you for telling people I wrote an important book and they should read it. But part of what happens in that book is, and maybe I'm getting ahead of it.
No, you're right on time.
Where we're going. Okay, cool. Part of what I do in this book, Being Bad, My Baby Brother, and the School to Prison Pipeline, which was my first book, is try to wrap my mind around how it could be that there are whole communities, whole swaths of communities of folks, particularly people of color who are also of some form of vulnerability, who have this trajectory from schools to different kinds of pit stops to jails and to prisons as like a regular occurrence in their lives and in their loved ones' lives. So whereas, most folks, all we have to think about is, getting our babies from kindergarten to elementary school, which by the way is such an odd thing to have kindergarten graduations, but whatever. So, we go from elementary school to middle school to high school to college to gainful employment and full participation in our democracy. And for some people, that trajectory is just as real as it is for the people who you love and care about to go to school with the full intention of, leaving whole and happy and well, and instead have an experience that you need to recover from. And so that recovery then leads you to all kinds of other places that ultimately end in, punitive institutionalization. So I wrote that book to try to understand that and wrap my mind around that thing and try to name it for myself first, but also to be able to articulate to other people what the school to prison pipeline is and what it looks like specifically as an educator, so that these folks who have, I think, all kinds of institutional capacity to make meaningful changes in young people's lives, that they are equipped with the vision, with the language, with the lenses, and with the tools to intervene in the pipeline in some meaningful way. I'll just add that, that labor is both a practical job, like what I do at the university, plus my writing and speaking and all that. That's a practical thing. I'm a practitioner. I'm a former high school history teacher turned professor, right? Teacher educator. Part of that is, for the love of the practice and the craft. Part of it, though, is extremely political. I firmly believe that teaching is a political act, and folks who tell me otherwise, we're going to have a good conversation. And also because I have a very personal stake in destroying the pipeline. And my brother, who is the center of the book that you mentioned, that we talked about a moment ago, is someone who traveled that pipeline. And even someone like me who's highly credentialed and super in tune with what's happening in the world, somehow missed so much of what the pipeline entails. And so I have a very personal commitment to trying to keep my eyes wide and tell people what I learned, so that there are fewer people and eventually no people in this pipeline.
No, that's really good. I want to talk about that too, and let's really get back to Chicago, because I'm from Chicago too, obviously, where Crystal's husband is one of my best friends. But we, as young men, and I think about Chicago, it's one of the most segregated cities in the country. There were some folks who talked about housing segregation and how housing segregation and educational segregation are, linked in a chain. And I think about how my mom, the first thing I think about is how she took us to these desegregation schools, right? These magnet schools, which I didn't know was a desegregation tool at the time. I just thought it was a good school, right? I went to a school called Beasley Academic Center, and then I went to a school called Whitney Young Magnet School. And just noticing that these schools were very different than the schools that were labeled bad schools. The second thing is that I'm also an educator. I started school as a graphic design major, Southern Illinois University, our alma mater. And I had a summer program job, and I saw young Black and Latinx boys getting separated in the summer program where they're supposed to be having fun, right? It's supposed to be a joyous experience. And I changed my major to early childhood education just to find out why that was happening. And so I think, because those boys were actually literally being labeled as bad, nobody really cared about, their experiences, their backgrounds, like the system in which they were interacting. I wanted to talk about your book for a minute. Can you give us a brief synopsis of not just the book, but those points that you mentioned about joy and about these really important points about teaching that will help us kind of see our way out of this pipeline?
Absolutely. Let me just acknowledge that I'm watching the chat. So if folks want to talk and kind of participate, I know there'll be time for Q&A, but
right.
just know that the chat is there. So Bill, I see your question. No, I don't typically get a response from folks who laugh at that response. I get people who are either frozen because I've spoken their truth, or they're frozen because they disagree. And either one of those, I think, are really helpful responses to the question of whether or not teaching is a political act. But I firmly believe that it's impossible to compartmentalize your whole self. Like, we try mightily to make decisions about, like, I'm going to hide this piece of me, and I'm going to hide that piece of me, and I'm going to forefront this other piece of me. And I just find it to be such a futile exercise and performative response to, the possibility of showing up as your full self, and acknowledging that each of us has our own baggage. We have our own experiences and our lenses, and whether or not we want to be clear with people about the fact that they exist is, sort of a choice that we can make. But I think we're better off if we're clear about the fact that we teach some things and we don't teach others, right?
That's right.
If we approach history and we forefront this particular canon and these particular people, that means that we're making decisions about excluding other folks. So, we can go on and on, but Bill, I just want to give you a direct response. No, I don't typically get that response, but thank you for offering that.
I want to add, I know Mr. Bill Betson too, is that, the construction of race is a political construction as well. Race and racism are political concepts. So even when policies are being made, they have a very overt or not overt racial lens on them. There's nothing, and this is it's coming from, this optimistic person who has read that, race is in everything. So I agree with that statement, and thank you, Bill, for that.
Yeah. So the book, chapter 2 in that book is my favorite chapter, in part because it's the place where I get clearest with myself, and then again with everybody else who reads the book, about what I think the school to prison pipeline entails and how it takes shape in Chicago and elsewhere, particularly in schools. And I love that we're following the conversation with the two kind of policy folks, people who are in tune with the legal world of the school to prison pipeline, because I'm in a different space and I'm coming at it from a different space as an educator. What I say in that chapter, and what I'll tell you here, is that I tend to see the school to prison pipeline in 3 ways. I don't know if it's a teacher thing, we do things in 3s, whatever, just so I'm showing up with 3 things today. Yeah. But they're kind of like close cousins of the school to prison pipeline, not triplets. And it's important to acknowledge that. And this is not a semantic thing. We ain't got time for that. We got really important things to do, and folks are dying in the street. So we got to get to it and figure out what we're trying to do and get clear about that so that we can pick up the tools and do the work. But it's important, I think, to understand there are these 3 ways of thinking about and talking about the school to prison pipeline so that you can figure out what resources that you need to tap into in order to do your work. One is the cradle to prison pipeline, which I think is a lot of what we heard in the previous session. It's really about kind of laws and macroeconomic policies that are supposed to govern, communities and make sure that babies from the cradle have all kinds of opportunities to develop whole, happy, holistic starts at life, right? These are laws and macroeconomic policies that are supposed to govern access to affordable housing, access to living wages, access to fully funded public education that is right in your neighborhood, access to food, et cetera, access to healthcare. That there are things that are supposed to be in place to make sure that young people have the best start, but are not, right? And oftentimes as educators, that feels like it's a little bit beyond our purview. So let me go on then to others. The school prison nexus, which is different from the cradle to prison pipeline, is trying to help us see that corrections is big business, and the existence of these places that house the invisible, that make invisible the real issues that we ought to be focused on, that that I just mentioned when I was talking about those laws and macroeconomic policies. Yeah. When we kind of put folks out of sight, out of mind, then we don't have to deal with problems in other systems, like systems of public education, that don't provide everything that folks need in order to live as they wish, right? When I talk to educators, so much of my work is organized around this third one, which is the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. And that is specifically focused on the policies, practices, and processes. There's another 3 because that's how we do it. Focus on the policies, practices, and processes that school adults create in school buildings. That create the conditions, once again, that young people feel that they need to recover from. So, part of what happens in the book and in my life post the book is that I've come to see, as an educator, again, that's the lens through which I do my work as an educator, I've come to see the school to prison pipeline in part as a problem of student engagement, as a problem of young people feeling that they have experienced what you might call learning lacerations or school wounds, which is this idea that you have been demeaned, you have been disrespected, you have been devalued in ways that really go against your fundamental humanity as a learner. And if there are school policies, practices, and processes that wound me as a 3-dimensional full human being, then there's no surprise, really, that I'm trying to get away from you, educator, right? That I'm trying to resolve in the best way that I know how to heal myself, even if that doesn't make sense to, highly credentialed people, and we would suggest that you do other things. But even if I disagree with the way in which some folks try to heal, I can also understand it. If you are committing harm against me, then I'm going to respond in ways that are protective to me. So the book and my work since the book have really brought me to a place where I've been able to distill down to like 7 very specific problems, harmful habits in teaching that are often circulated, taught, reused, recycled. That if we can see them as problems and we can provide an alternative to those and use like high leverage healing practices, we could honestly be in a better place as educators and have fewer young people who are trying to get away from us. If we have time, I'm happy to offer those.
That's really good. I want to put some historical context on here too, because I want to talk to you about how school segregation has affected teachers in the classroom. I think about this story too, as a historian. Thelma Page Richardson, which a lot of people don't know about, was a teacher in the 40s in Dallas. She moved to Dallas from Denver and found out that Black teachers were being paid less than white teachers. She decided to sue, particularly because Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP at the time really wanted to go against the notion that they were being paid less in the first place. Dallas ISD at the time said that Black teachers should be getting less money than white teachers because they came from segregated universities, particularly HBCUs, which prepared teachers, Black teachers at that time exclusively because Black teachers could not go to predominantly white institutions. But Thelma Page Richardson was she went to integrated schools her whole life in Denver, and went to predominantly white institutions in Denver, and was a great case in actually normalizing teacher pay between Black and white teachers. And I think about how, they used segregation in that example, but also how less pay affected those teachers, how a lack of resources affected those teachers, a lack of support from the community when it comes to resources affected those teachers. So share a little bit about how you think the school segregation affects classrooms and teaching.
Yeah. Let me just say that, every crisis, and we're in multiple crises, right now, but every crisis presents an opportunity. And I don't mean to confuse this with being opportunistic, but every crisis bursts open all kinds of pieces of knowledge, bits and nuggets of knowledge that we should be picking up and then utilize to make better choices about what the next iteration of life is going to look like for us. And, what gives me pause is, you know, of course, part of what you're talking about. And as someone who works at a predominantly Black institution, and my job is to shore up the capacity of mostly Black educators to go out in this moment of crisis and pick up the bits of knowledge and, you know, do things differently moving forward. I feel really privileged to be in this moment. But also, like, this is a time when we can be imagining, right? Yeah. This is a time when we can be expanding our creativity and what's possible, really rethinking what's possible for what schooling can look like. And, you know, every crisis always additionally presents an opportunity for people to fuck things up even more. So there are also right now, you know, lots of people thinking about how can I use my resources to, you know, have my own pod, these micro schools and micro pods popping up to make sure that the heavily resourced folks make sure that their young people don't fall behind, right? So we're in this moment where segregation exists because of long-standing policies and practices that continue to keep us from each other. But then, you know, there are also opportunities for people to, you know, recreate new ways to hyper segregate. And, you know, the uneven resource distribution and access is certainly creating new ways of us seeing schools as opportunities to reproduce the haves and the have-nots, right? While some folks are getting their own tutors and having school in their backyard, there are other folks who are like, how do I get a laptop to make sure that my kid can, you know, connect to the Google Classroom at an appropriate time? So I don't know, I think part of what really moves me and gets me excited about this moment is that we all get an opportunity to sit back and say, okay, what things didn't go so well in the pre-COVID, you know, way of doing schooling, and how can we disinvest from those commitments and create new commitments that are in the vision for what we want education to really look like. And I think moving away from whimsy, being agile, being flexible, being willing to come up with, you know, whatever the new moment requires of us quickly is a beautiful thing, but that's different from whimsy. So I think so many people show up for young people like any kind of way, just like, hey, you know, I'm an educator, I'm highly credentialed, or I'm a policymaker, I'm highly credentialed. I got a lot of people who are trusting in me, so I'm just gonna show up and do what I do. I think we should instead be moving away from I'm shooting from the hip to I'm gonna come from a strong core. I'm gonna develop a non-negotiable set of practices and principles through which I'm gonna do all that I do, so that regardless of what this new moment invites, I have all 10 toes to the ground. Let me be more specific. Mm-hmm. I'm a yogi, and I'm a yoga teacher to educators. And so much of the way in which I see the world comes from kind of a yogic path, right? But anybody who's into fitness, and I'm tempted to do a little poll in the chat, but I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Right. Anybody who's into any kind of fitness, if it's gymnastics, if it's running, if it's yoga, if it's whatever it is, we know that you cannot do anything safely, like nothing, without a strong core. Stay with me, y'all. I promise this is going somewhere. Without a strong core, right? These muscles right here in the center that wrap all around your back, because if you don't have a strong core and you're doing all the things that keep you happy physically, your body will overcompensate and you will feel it in your lower back and your hips and your knees, etc. I would argue that though that's true anatomically, that educationally the same is true. That unless we are showing up with a strong core, unless we have at the front of our mind, regardless of the techniques, the tactics, the curriculum, if we know the non-negotiable principles through which we will do our work, for me, those are love, justice, and joy. But for you and whoever else, it can be whatever moves you. Yeah. Unless we are showing up from that place, somebody is gonna get hurt. Firmly believe that. And this moment enables me to ask questions. What would those non-negotiable principles look like? And if folks who run those laws and macroeconomic policies that we talked about earlier, and the people who are invested in the business of corrections, and the people who are interested in redoing and rethinking school policies, practices, and processes, then ask themselves, what are the non-negotiable principles through which we are going to show up in this new unprecedented moment? If we all got to ask that question, boy, we would come on the other side of this in an entirely different place that we went into it.
Stay there, because I have a question that is related to that. from Rhonda. And speaking of microeconomics, Rhonda wants to know, how do community members lean in to assist with destroying the school to prison pipeline that has strong corporate interests for many, right? We know that it's not just segregation out here that's harming folks, that someone is benefiting from the segregation. So
Yes. Okay, thanks, Rhonda, for the question. I think this is a really important time to, I think necessarily the boundaries between what is home and what is school and what is community have just completely collapsed. Like we're all part of one crew. So we first need to acknowledge that we're just all part of one crew. Yeah. Which I think is a beautiful thing, because you can say stuff to your family. You can communicate with family in ways that are really uncomfortable, but also move the needle, right? We can have a kind of straight talk. We can cut the underbrush. We can just get straight to things that need to be said, knowing that it's coming from a place of love and a place of commitment. And so I think what we ought to be saying to the people who are responsible for serving our babies, and you can plug in whatever makes sense to you, I think that we should be asking ourselves, are you thinking critically about this moment that we're in? And I don't mean critical as in like your ability to develop well-reasoned arguments, right? We're credentialed, we're experienced, we can do that. What I'm saying is that we need to be in a moment where we're pushing people to consciously unpack and constantly rethink the way it is. Mm-hmm. So, we got our current occupant of the White House using and abusing the phrase, "it is what it is." So let's reclaim it for a moment and then ask ourselves, what might it mean if we push against this idea that it is what it is? And instead we become people who are deliberately, constantly saying, if this is what it is, who does it serve? Who does it disempower? Mm-hmm. And how can things be otherwise? Critical thinking as consciously unpacking and constantly reimagining the way it is by saying, who does this serve? Who does this disempower? And how can things be otherwise? So, Rhonda, that may mean that we are asking people in the family, again, plug in whoever you have in mind, that we're asking those folks to look at retribution, since we're talking about the school to prison pipeline, and so much of what we think about related to the school to prison pipeline focuses on behavior and discipline and punishment. How about we ask folks to move away from retribution as the default, as the primary way that we deal with issues of harm and healing? And instead, what might it mean to really move toward resisting the urge to punish? Like, that could be a really important step in the right direction. And it means something really specific. It means that we move away from the age-old practices. And I'm just going into one area that's focused on the school to prison pipeline and the ways in which we can be doing things differently, Rhonda and everybody else. There are a set of practices, for example, that we've been holding on to for a very, very long time as it's relevant to issues of harm and healing. I'm gonna run down a quick list that we think that it's perfectly legitimate and okay. It is what it is when we have issues of harm and healing in schools to utilize detentions, suspensions, expulsions, to fine young people. Here in Chicago, just a few years ago, there was a large a large network of schools that made $250,000 annually from student discipline fines, right? And which is bad enough, but then you add on to the fact that this network is embedded in largely low-income communities of color, which is bad enough. And then you add on to that this network was so slick about this punishment mechanism that they connected the fines to grade retention. So that if you are in 8th grade and you have accumulated enough of these silly fines, by the way, these fines are like, you have a button unbuttoned on your button-down shirt, $5. You come into school holding a bag of chips, $5. You're in line, supposed to be in line, and you get out of line, $5. So if you're in 8th grade and you have accumulated enough of these silly fines that your low-income family cannot pay, guess what? You don't go to 9th grade. You get retained in grade for these student discipline fines, and we're going to punish you which we as education researchers, particularly people who are concerned about the school to prison pipeline, know that that transition between 8th and 9th grade is a key year when young people make decisions about whether or not they'll continue on the educational trajectory, or if school ain't for them and they're ready to do something different. So detention, suspensions, expulsions, fines, grade retention, we still use ability tracking in ways that are problematic. We still counsel young people out of schools. We get real slick and say, hey, did you see the school down the street, right? Have you considered, I was a high school teacher, have you considered the Job Corps? Have you considered all these alternative spaces that are not my space because I got stuff to do and you getting on my nerves? We use beatings in 19 states. We still, think that corporal punishment is the move. And we also arrest young people. We put booking stations in our schools to make arrests easier, faster, and more efficient. So like what we can be doing is very explicitly saying to people in the family, hey, look, we've been doing this thing the same way for a really long time. And guess what? All the numbers and the stories indicate that that is not helping.
That's right.
That it is moving away from the very foundational thing that does work, which is developing trusting, healthy, sustainable relationships, creating schools where whatever school looks like, if it's the way in which traditionally school takes form, or if it's out in somebody's yard, that school is created on a foundation and a climate and culture that has everything to do with how we relate to one another. So I think those are like, and that's just focused on discipline.
No,
Lots of other things that we could be talking about, but that's something concrete.
I have many other questions for you, Laura, but I'm gonna have to end there. Our time is out. Again, her book is called Being Bad, My Baby Brother in the School to Prison Pipeline. Check it out. I posted some things in the chat for you. I want to, thank Children at Risk and Dr. Bob and his whole staff. Thank you again, Dr. Laura, for joining us.
Of course, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Dr. Laura, before you go, I just want one question. So we're talking about desegregation in the classroom as one of the, what does a classroom look like that, think of the general public, and we're trying to describe this ideal world where we have a desegregated classroom. What is the benefit to the child? Talk about the benefit to all the kids in that classroom.
Sure. I think the desegregated classroom that we're looking for in the future has three things. It is multicultural, it is multilingual, and it is responsive to the lived experiences of the young people in that space. That's it. It is multicultural, it is multilingual, it is responsive to the lived experiences, to the everyday lives of the young people in that space. And if we are all in a place where we are not just exposed to diversity in all of its forms, but we are instead saying that acknowledging each other's three-dimensional humanity is the jumping off point through which we will learn ourselves and each other, then I think that we're creating a smarter microcosm of what this, the larger world can and ought to be.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Laura. Jerry, let me ask you a question, because I always feel like you're so insightful on things. In the state of Texas, do you think we're going to be able to use this great opportunity in front of us right now, where so many people are actualized right now around some of these issues that you and I have been talking about for ages? Mm-hmm. Are we going to be able to use that to focus on the desegregation of our schools?
Well, so I think we don't have a choice. Texas is already majority people of color state. The Chicago to Dallas connection is very important because policies and practices and processes, as Crystal talks about, has led almost an exodus of over 200,000 Black people from Chicago, and a lot of them are landing in Texas. I'm one of those people, right, 10 years ago. And so now Texas has the largest Black population, just by population, not percentage, in the country of Black people, right? And we also have this large Latinx population that is growing, right? Dallas County is supposed to be 88% people of color by 2050. So I don't think we have a choice. I think in our earlier panel, we talked about how white parents, and this is you got to be very clear about this, just refused to have their kids in integrated schools. Yeah. So I think we have to address that, and I think that a lot of folks are at this point. There's been some school innovation. It talks about, integrating schools by income, which is kind of the proxy for race, you know? But I think as now these suburban places and exurbs, like the discussion is happening in Southlake right now, this is a big discussion. And then the discussion is happening in Austin with defund the police and how Governor Abbott is trying to fight against that. I think we'll see more folks joining this discussion and fight. So,
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you both very much for being here. Crystal Orb, Chicago State.
Thank you.
And Jerry Hawkins, my buddy from Dallas Truth, Racial Justice and Healing. Thank you. Racial Healing and Transformation. Sorry, Jerry.
it's long, it's all right. But thank you again.
Thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you.
And all the way, even after slavery ended, in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court said separate but equal was constitutional. You could be separate and equal was constitutional. And we know that it was never, ever equal. It would take another, close to 60 years in Brown versus the Board of Education for the Supreme Court to reconsider that and say separate but equal is unconstitutional, but inherently unequal. But we did not see the segregation in there. We did not see the resource inequities, not in 1954, not in 1964, but even by law, there were things that was happening. We can go back to the redlining that was happening by law under the Federal Housing Administration, where they would provide loans to individuals or refinance to individuals, and based on how the community and where the community was situated, the makeup of the community, it was either deemed to be a hazardous community or a best community, a community that was desired. If you lived in a hazardous community, which was more often primarily populated by people of color, it was far more difficult to get along, far more difficult for those individuals to develop any type of equity in their homes. If you lived in the best community, it was more likely that you would get those things. Even after in 1968, it took 1968 for the Federal Housing Administration to ban that policy. But after that, we know that tax property-based funding of our school districts often creates an alignment between the level of segregation that we see and the level of economic segregation that we see. I say that to say that, again, these are all policies and practices that were put in place. We will likely always have individuals who have racial biases. That will likely exist today and forever. But what makes it systemic racism is when we adopt the policies that allow a system to be set up where groups of people are forced into situations where they have negative outcomes because of these policies. And I spoke about the redlining that happened in 1938, and the policy ended in 1968. But there was a recent study that indicates today that 2/3 of the neighborhoods that were deemed to be hazardous as a part of that redlining policy in the 1930s are still inhabited by mostly minority populations, 2/3. On the flip side, 91% of the areas classified as best in the 1930s remain middle to upper class and 85% white. So you can't overcome these systemic disparities without also putting in place the types of policies that change the trajectory. We're not going to program our way out of this. I often say programs are progress, but policy is power. And even, recently in the paper, there was a story out of Jacksonville, Florida, how a family, African-American family, got their home appraised, and it appraised 40% below the value that they anticipated, or 100,000 below the value. And when they went back in the home and they removed every picture that gave any indication of Blackness, and had the home reappraised, it reappraised 40% higher. So these things exist, and they impact the type of educational experience that students of color experience today. So throughout our history, African American students have access to schools, but because of these disparities, these systemic policies and practices, their learning potential still remains shackled or constrained. And when we have these types of segregated environments, they become microcosms of the systemic racism that we see in a larger population. And a lot of it has been talked about. More likely to see the police in schools and less likely to see counselors and nurses, less educational resources, more punitive learning environments, metal detectors and what have you. We all are all aware of what happened in Colorado and Columbine, but there are more metal detectors in a school in the south side of Chicago than what you would see in Columbine today. So all of this plays out into creating the types of web of policies and practices that must be addressed across the board. While we're talking about the education setting, the research done by Sean Reardon out of Stanford University, and from what we've heard from parents and students across the board, student learning begins before they enter the building, while they're in the building, and after they leave the building. So unless we build a system to address the other areas within the system that don't provide students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn, it is going to be very difficult for us to create an educational system that's able. I'm not talking about one particular school and trying to scale that up. That model has not been successful. But if we care about addressing it across the system, we also have to address these other issues: access to affordable housing, access to healthy food, access to healthcare. These are all education issues. Civic engagement is an education issue. It's why at the Schott Foundation, one of the things that, after hearing parents talk about what was happening across the board and many of the barriers, we developed an index that we call the Loving Cities Index. Because number one, the research clearly shows that what happens outside of the school setting is equally as damaging or helpful as what happens inside of the school setting. And secondly, for the last couple of decades, we've been living under a standards-based reform agenda rather than a supports-based reform agenda. And what do I mean there? The conversation that parents and students were having around their schools was not about accountability or about standards, but the questions they were asking is, does this school care for my child? Is it committed? Do they have the capacity? Does this school system love my child? And so we called it the Loving Cities Index because we want to be able to measure in various cities across the country, to what degree are the cities providing the cross-sector supports that are necessary to change the trajectory of policies that are related to segregation, and as cities begin to resegregate, to what degree are they providing the supports, the cross-sector supports, where students can have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. So when you take a city like Dallas, Texas, where the history starts with the Wichita and Comanche and Caddo and Cherokee natives being in the land and being forced off of the land in 1854 by General Tarrant through an armed expedition in Three Forks. And that's important to note because we can't talk about, while we talk about resegregation, we also have to talk about the forced relocation of people. Otherwise, we will see that it happens again. These things are cyclical if we don't name them. So there was a forced relocation, there was segregation, then there was resegregation in Dallas. And even the first settlers in Dallas, white settlers in 1859, they brought slaves with them. 1 out of 10 1 out of every 10 people that were there were slaves. And I talked about the redlining that happened, and it also happened in Dallas. But the redlining happened and the segregation happened not only with the schools, but Mexicans were kept out of the parks, the theaters. So the segregation was across the system. It wasn't until 1961 that the Fifth Circuit Court ordered desegregation to begin in Dallas, and efforts to integrate were largely unsuccessful up until 1980. In 2003, Dallas was released from the court oversight of desegregation, but schools continue to be racially segregated. As Gary Orfield highlighted, Latino students are the most segregated. They attend schools that are 80% Latino. Black students attend schools that are 50% Black and 45% Latino, whereas the northern part of the Dallas school district is predominantly white, and even a closely positioned area of town, Highland Park, is 86% white, compared to Dallas, which is a majority people of color. So these are the things that historically, if we want to begin to address the policies that led us to this moment, we've got to put in place very deliberate policies to give students more access to affordable housing, more access to transportation, healthy food, and build a loving system that provides them an opportunity to learn.
John, I want to open it up to some questions, and people could use the chat box, or they could unmute themselves if they want to, and unmute their video if they want to ask you in person, since we have about 8 minutes or so for questions. I wanted to ask, though, I so identify with the whole loving cities, this idea, especially that everything is tied together. And I think 8 years ago, Children at Risk passed a piece of legislation mandating universal free breakfast for all low-income schools, which wasn't happening, surprisingly, even though the money was there. And we've seen a lot more of the high-performing low-income schools since then, right? As long as kids eat, it can have a big difference. But when you look at the low-hanging fruit to the big ideas, with loving cities, I mean, what are some of the easy low-hanging fruit ideas, and what are some of the big ideas that you hope to accomplish over time? You're muted, John. Sorry. There you go.
Okay. Even what you just highlighted, there's no reason why we're still dealing with the access to food for young people. And there's a lot of conversation of just doing a universal, food lunch program. That's an easy win, and we know that it's necessary to provide students an opportunity to learn. The very fact that many of the schools don't have the type of mental health counseling for young people. And we know the students who are there, the level of trauma that's happening pre-COVID and definitely post-COVID, that the resources can be made available, especially when we think about how we reallocate resources that are dedicated to policing and security. Those are strange fruits within a school setting. You think you would have educators, you would have counselors, you would have nurses. Police are strange fruit in a education setting. So how then do we reinvest those dollars into the things that we know increase student opportunity to learn? And then, Bob, there are some, this is not going to happen without some hard choices. There are some choices we're going to have to make about giving families access to affordable housing, access to livable wages, because these are two, significant barriers to giving students the type of educational opportunity that they need to be successful.
And when we think about big ideas, it does seem that, I work in the children's rights world, right? And it seems like for a long time, you'd have a lot of organizations that wouldn't talk about livable wages, but you really can't separate that, can you? And especially the housing issue, it's very hard to separate that.
Yeah, I worked at the Department of Education in the Clinton administration, and I support the existence of an entity, a federal agency that would provide support to states around education. But I honestly believe that we've outlived at the federal and state level this structure where there's a Department of Education, a Department of Health and Human Service, a Department of Commerce. There needs to be a Department of Youth and Family Success to eliminate the redundancy, to better coordinate the resources, much in the same way that after 9/11, we saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security to do just that, better channel resources, reduce the redundancy. So structurally, there has to be a better way to get resources to family and children, because we've got to recognize that learning community could be the learning platform, and the building is a part of that platform. But learning happens across the community, especially for Black and brown young people.
Can you tell us a little bit more, John, about your work in the Loving Cities? Because to me, that's a real important concept.
Well, we have conducted these profiles on 20 cities across the country. None of the cities are offering over 52% of the supports needed for all students to have an opportunity to learn. There are 26 indicators. You can look at the report at schottfoundation.org. Our goal is to provide a profile for 50 cities by 2022, not to publish them in a gotcha sort of way, but to identify what additional supports are necessary. In each of the cities, there's some things that they're doing well, and there are other areas that they're challenged. But we want to identify for public policymakers and for philanthropy, where should you invest to provide more supports? Let's shift from the standards-based agenda that says, here's the benchmark, meet this benchmark, to a supports agenda that says what supports are necessary so that all students, regardless of zip code and background, can meet those high standards.
Are there some examples of extraordinary best practices that a particular city does, knowing that not all cities are doing everything right, but are there a couple examples of things that you find particularly good?
I think we can look at Buffalo, and with the Buffalo Community Foundation and what they're doing there across the district. And monthly, they pull together a group of parents and students, higher education, legal services, and they meet monthly and they track the data. So it's very, data informed, and both data from the university, but data that's given from parents and students. And they have earnestly set out to begin to meet those support needs. You will find a similar structure in Long Beach, working with the California Endowment Foundation, where they are working across issues, because young people don't live in silos. They don't live in portfolios. So they're working across issues. They're meeting together. They've created a big tent. So if there's anything I would say, I think it's great we have these conversations around education where we can have these conversations with a larger tent. I think we'll see more progress.
So one question here, do you see any opportunity to look at assessment and accountability critically at this time to make it more reflective of what students know and are able to do?
Yeah, I think we're going to, one thing that COVID presented, in order for us to address the learning gaps that have already happened since March, and address the learning gaps that will likely happen because of poor remote learning, resources, we're going to have to liberate learning, what I call liberate learning. Break the box of learning happens in a 180-day schedule, as other countries have gone on to 200s beyond that, and even liberate how we measure learning. Trust educators, formative assessments. We cannot rely on standardized tests. To think that you would get a standardized outcome with the host of inequities that exist right now is a belief in magic. And I think that we've got to go to more formative assessments and competency-based assessments that gives educators and teachers more time to teach and students more time to learn. And as we adjust the calendar of the school year, we give students less time to forget what they learned.
Dr. Jackson, I think I'll make this the final question. They may keep us in our breakout room longer, but when we look at the data, and if you look at trends of the data, there's no reason for us to be optimistic, right? I mean, the data doesn't look good around the status of our children, the majority of our children. But what makes you optimistic? What are the things that are happening that you start thinking, wow, this could be it?
You know, with everything that we've experienced over, I'll say 2020, when I was out there and I saw the number of young people who were in the streets marching, and not just young people from one racial or ethnic background, but across the board, they were there, they were informed, and they were pushing for new systems. I'm optimistic that the infrastructures that have been supporting systemic racism have been so weakened now that it's created this transformative moment and with the power of these young people, they are ready to build better structures in our system. So that gives me optimism that they are mobilized, they are informed, and the past systems have been so weakened that it's time to build a new America. And I think that they can get it done.
It's amazing. My daughter lives in Brooklyn, and she was doing a FaceTime with me live as she marched across the Brooklyn Bridge during one of the protests. And I started crying, right, to see everyone wearing their masks, and marching. It was, and we had staff members, right, from Children at Risk that were doing that in Houston and in Dallas. And it's fantastic, right, to see that happening.
Yeah, long ago they said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I'm encouraged because we've got young people who are going to spend the next 20 to 30 years with their shoulders on that arc, bending it toward justice.
Yeah, very good. So Tamar, are you doing technical here? When do we get sent back to the other room? Do you know?
I'm not sure. It should be
Any minute.
now.
Okay, I'll do one more stretch question and then we'll go from there. John, what is I have heard a lot of people during the coronavirus, during this pandemic, talk about this is an opportunity for us to do something different, but I see very little action. And what I often tell people is like, if we want to see something different, we're going to need to take action. And if anything, I see a greater separation, right? Because of we heard about the pods, the community pods, and access to the internet and the high speed. I see this separation, but what do you see coming out of the pandemic, and what are you worried about? What are you heartened about?
Well, I think that there's going to be a level of creativity that's going to be led by educators and parents and communities just by the very nature of need. In many respects, the federal government has left many of these communities on their own. And as a matter of survival, they are being very innovative. Now, how those innovations bubble up, which we've always asked for, the innovations to bubble up, is going to be critically important. And I think that there's an opportunity for the next administration at the federal level to then survey these innovations and invest in bringing them up at the federal level. But I also think, and it goes back to the conversation that we were having about systemic racism. If we looked over our history, we've used a legal lever through the 50s and 60s, the Civil Rights Act, which Gary Orfield talked about, the ESEA as a part of war and poverty, but we haven't used the financial lever to begin to address systemic racism. I think it's time for us to really call for a racial equity stimulus package. And it's a stimulus package that is designed to use the financial lever to reduce disparities in critical areas. In the wealth gap, which has to do with housing and the result of the redlining because Black and brown parents were not able to get equity in their homes during that period, support for small businesses, and definitely in education to liberate learning, to provide more opportunities, criminal justice reform, because there's a great deal of our talent and wealth that's behind bars. And then we've got to invest in people. We have one of the worst parental leave laws across the world. And the ability for parents to raise young people, invest in early childhood education, provide the types of stimulus support to families during this period. So I think, it has to be a part of a very deliberate effort to reinvest the resources to take on this challenge around systemic racism. And if we think about it this way, Bob, if you look at slavery, free labor, if you look at how land was taken from Native Americans, that was wealth. If you look at the annexation of Mexico territory, that was wealth. All of these actions was a down payment on this home that we call America today. But the very people who paid the price for that, they were never welcome in the home. I think it's time to return some of those resources in such a way where we invest in creating a new America where everyone's welcome home.
You mentioned parental leave. There are only 2 countries in the world that don't have parental leave policies, and it's the United States and Papua New Guinea. So it really is a shame, right? It's
It is.
not even talking industrialized. We're talking any country, right? It's
Absolutely.
The last thing I'll add is, you talk about this idea of the opportunity in terms of this racial equity investment. And in a sense, Jerry Hawkins and I, who was on earlier, we were talking about this a couple months ago. And I said, Jerry, do you see any optimism? He said, well, who would have thought that we would all, if you're out of work, you'd get $600 a week. It's like a universal payment. Anything is possible, right? And in a sense, that is sort of a racial equity stimulus in a sense, right? That's really kept a lot of people out of poverty.
That's right. And let's continue it. This is not as foreign in a lot of other countries, and it's far from socialism. It's not as foreign as in a lot of other countries. It's not foreign to what we have done for many corporations. It's really taking and investing in the levers that are important it's a stimulus package also. So eliminating racism is a stimulus package. So the further we go at addressing these disparities and closing those gaps, we will see our economy stronger, our educational system stronger, and our future stronger.
Yeah, so many possibilities. I mean, we're going through so much transition as a country, as a world right now, that I just hope we take advantage of it and go the right way. And November is going to be a big time, right? A lot of people get to decide the direction of our country as we move into November. And it'll be a big determinant of where we go, I think. So, Dr. Jackson, thank you very, very much for all that you do. And we didn't get into anything much about Schott Foundation, but I'd love to do that at some point. But I could always touch base with you separately. So
absolutely, I would love to. And thank you for convening this.
Absolutely, thank you. All
right. I wanted to start off just by telling you a little bit about who I am, because I think it influences the way I think about these issues. And I think it's important to the perspective that I bring. So I brought a couple of pictures with me here today. If you start in the top left, the first 2 pictures, the one in the top left and in the middle, are pictures of my grandfather. His name was Lewis Redding, and he was born in 1901. So he died when I was quite young, but he went to Brown University in the 1920s. Went to Harvard Law School in the late 1920s, was the only Black graduate of his class, and in I believe it was 1929 or 27 at Harvard, and went on to be the only Black lawyer in Delaware for about a quarter century. And in Delaware, he brought cases against the state to integrate the University of Delaware, brought cases against the municipalities, which then became part of Brown versus Board. So you see him in the picture in the top left. You'll probably recognize some of these folks, but my grandfather's third from the left, and then he's standing right next to Thurgood Marshall there. They were part of the same legal team that won Brown v. Board in 1954. So this picture was taken on the steps of the Supreme Court. I start with my grandfather because he's my inspiration for what I do. Although I didn't get to know him very well as a kid, I got to know him through stories that my mother would tell about him and that family members would tell about him, and just became really interested in his life's work, and it became my life's work. So I got into education in large part because I was really interested in trying to understand the discrepancy between what I was told about Brown versus Board and what my lived experience was as a kid going to public middle school, elementary school, middle school, and high school in North Carolina, where, I went to a fairly diverse school, but we were tracked. And so my classes didn't look anything like the rest of the school did. And that for me was the start of a lifelong passion for education and pursuit of this issue, to try and figure out, why is it that we are largely segregated as a society? In the upper right, you'll see a picture of me with some of my then fifth graders. All of these kids are in high school now, but they were then fifth graders at Langston Hughes Academy in New Orleans. I was a principal in New Orleans of a pre-K through 8 school, and started there as a teacher, spent almost a decade. And so love that school with my whole heart, and make frequent trips back there. Although I'm starting to recognize less and less of the kids, because it's been quite a few years since I've been there. I went to go to graduate school to study this issue, and spent some time in the New York City Department of Education. So that's the Tweed building that's pictured in the bottom. In the middle, I worked under Chancellor Carranza, specifically on issues of school integration. And so that's also informed a lot of the way that I think about this issue and how it plays out in large systems. Enough about me. What are we talking about here today? So we don't have much time, but what I want to get into is thinking about, this is the end of the day. So we're trying to get towards solutions. We've heard tons about how did we get here? What are the complexities of the problems? Let's talk about how we might move forward. It's equally complex, if not even more complex than how we got here, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the social and political circumstances that we find ourselves in. I want to give a couple of concrete and tangible examples of how we might combat this. And then I want us to talk about, well, what is realistic? What are the levers that we should really be pushing on more than others, given that this is such a complex set of circumstances that we're dealing with? So let's talk very briefly. Again, I'm going to be very brief here because you've had a whole morning of what the context is. But a couple of statistics that I like because they really bring to life this issue is, if we consider right now, okay, what does school segregation look like right now along racial lines in the United States of America? A fifth of our schools have almost no white students in them. And then another fifth have almost no students of color. So we got 2/5 of American public schools that are highly segregated today. I'm not talking about historical context. And then if we look along lines of economics, we talk a lot about socioeconomic segregation, obviously for many of the reasons that were mentioned earlier today, not the least of which the parents involved decision in the Supreme Court. And we know that socioeconomic status can often be a proxy, not always a proxy for race, but we look at socioeconomic segregation, and it's increased dramatically over the last 30 years by 30% within the largest 100 school districts in our country, which serve a disproportionate amount of our students. And then finally, and this has been alluded to all throughout the afternoon, and I'll give some resources to where you can find more concrete examples of research about this, but we've reached a near consensus in the research community about the positive effects of school integration on students. So when this is done right, we have really great benefits that accrue not just at the individual level, but at the societal level. And it's important that people are aware of those. I would be remiss if I didn't pause here for a second and just talk a little bit about the moment that we're in, because if this presentation is all about how do we move forward, we have to really consider the context that we're in right now. We're in this quote unquote George Floyd moment. I put moment in quotations because I think that's really the question at the end of the day is this a moment, or does this represent a significant departure in the public attitudes about race, racial discrimination, and the remedies for those things in this country? We hear a lot of talk about this moment is different, this time is different. I, as a X person, I, as a Y person, am willing to stand up and make individual choices that are different in the name of making our society confront these issues. The question is, how far is this actually going to go? And of course, we're frequently met with new things that happen. So for me, one of the things I've been thinking most about in the last 48 hours is this father to 4 children who was shot 7 times just 2 days ago, trying to re-enter his vehicle. And so, just in the moments where we think we have reached a new place of enlightenment, we keep being confronted with these issues. So this is front and center for me. I imagine it's front and center for a lot of people. How does it impact the way forward? One more note on this, which is, there's been tons of discussion about this in all corners of the country. It has largely focused on criminal justice reform. And criminal justice reform is hugely important. I think we can all agree about that. But if we don't address the heart of the matter, which is historical, the perpetration historically of discrimination against people of color and Black folks in particular in all parts, in all of our institutions, then we're not getting at the heart of the matter. And we all, all of us have touch points with education for a reason. I think a lot of us think that it is, at the end of the day, the key place where we think change can happen societally. If we're not talking about this in terms of schools and our history and present moment of segregation, then I don't think we're ever going to actually move past this issue. So that's the connection for me between all of the things that are happening in education. And I don't see it being talked about a lot, at least not in some of the circles, outside of the circles that many of us are in. So let's also look at what public attitudes are. So I wanted to make sure that 2019 was really large here, because this was a poll that was taken before the past few months, where a lot of racial attitudes have changed. But I think it's really important to take a look at this. So a lot of information on the screen. I'm just going to call your attention to one thing. The question here is, do you feel racial concentration or segregation in U.S. public schools is a serious problem? 57% of American adults polled believe it's a serious problem. That's higher than it's been in many years. And then it's really interesting then to also look at the breakout along racial demographic lines. So 52% of whites agree, 68% of Blacks, and 65% of Latinos, okay? Now, when Gallup asked the question whether the government should be taking steps to reduce school segregation, you get a slight majority. So 53% of adults across the country believe that there is a role for government in addressing segregation. And of course, there are differences along different demographic groups. Now, I wanted to add two more polls in here. And there was a Harvard study that was taken specifically on school integration in 2020. Again, this was at the beginning of this year. So this was before all of the protests happened in response to George Floyd. I think that's really important to note. And in that study, they found 81% of respondents agree that it's important for students of different races to go to school together. So they asked the question a slightly different way than they did in the Gallup survey, but they're just basically trying to understand, is there a broad base of support for students going to schools together? And they found that indeed there was. And interestingly enough, there's only 63% of respondents who agree when the question is posed in terms of economic terms instead of different races, which I found to be quite interesting, because the sort of common understanding for a lot of people is that socioeconomic integration is more palatable than racial integration. And here we're getting a different read. I also wanted to make sure we included from that particular poll what parents' most important factors in selecting a school are, because we've seen time and time again, even in places where people say, yes, I agree, students of different backgrounds should be going to school together, individual actions don't always follow the stated philosophical opinions of people. And so what the researchers found was that there were other factors that people were weighting significantly higher than their students attending a racially or socioeconomically diverse schools, and that those were often the obstacles to people making the decisions to send their students to these types of schools. Now, whether this was perception or whether this is reality, so perception of certain schools or the reality is a completely different question. But at the top of the list, when people were given a set of factors and they were asked to choose their top three, at the top of the list was academic quality, 81%, 70% was safety in number 2. And then there were a host of other reasons, and racial and socioeconomic diversity came in closer to the bottom of that list at 10%, which is another interesting finding. Again, before the current moment that we're in, but still earlier this year. Finally, I wanted to give a little bit of data around attitudes on race after this George Floyd moment. So Monmouth took a poll in 2020 about Americans' views on race. 76% of Americans say that racial and ethnic discrimination is a big problem in the United States. That's up 25 percentage points, which in terms of societal attitudes on an issue in just a span of 5 years is a monumental jump. There are very few issues in which attitudes change this significantly. The question that I have, and I think we all should be asking ourselves, and I want you to think about, is what effect does this have, if any, on Americans' attitudes on segregation and the role that segregation plays in some of these bigger issues of racial and ethnic discrimination in the United States? Really quickly, the political environment. This was touched on earlier slightly with Gary Orfield. I think it's really, really important for us to consider what the stated platforms are and the stated actions of the current administration are, if we want to sort of think about what the role of federal policy could be months and years down the road. And so it's important and I tried to do this as objectively as possible, literally just to take language from the platform of of Biden and Harris, and to take actual things that have happened over the course of the Trump and Pence administration to just try and show what the differences are in terms of wanting to promote, creating policies to promote school integration versus those that don't. And so Biden's platform looks to reinstate DOE guidance that was rescinded by the Trump administration, and to continue the practice that existed at the very end of the Obama administration under Secretary King of providing grants for local implementation of diversity and integration programs. And then it's also important to note that there was a spat between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on the issue of busing. Joe Biden historically, and this is often misstated, it is not that Joe Biden was against integration. It's that Joe Biden specifically was against busing as a tool for integration, which in the 70s was a huge, was a very common place for progressives to be on this issue, in that many white progressives favored school integration but did not favor busing as a tool. And a lot of that, we don't have time to get into it right now, a lot of that has to do with historically the way that the word busing has been framed to basically conjure up all sorts of different types of images and feelings about integration, more so than the actual use of buses as a transportation method. And then the Trump administration has taken a couple of actions that indicated that not only will integration not be a priority for this administration, but they disagree with some of the tools that have historically been used to promote those, both in the housing and education spaces. So that's just really quickly the political environment on the federal level. Let's look at some tangible solutions that have been done across the country. And this is really what the Century Foundation spends a lot of its time doing in terms of its research work, which is where has this worked? What are different places doing across the country? So let's just get really concrete here. So one method for desegregation and to promote integration is to redraw attendance zone boundaries. We're all familiar with this. There have been attempts at this in many places across the country. This is typically the most controversial thing that you could propose in a school district for a number of reasons. And I think there are a lot of questions around, does that hold today? Are the same people who are willing to go out and protest about George Floyd interested now in potentially entertaining a conversation about redrawing district boundaries? So we have here an example of Eden Prairie School District, which from 2010 to 2011 instituted new attendance zone boundaries specifically focused on trying to even out the number of students who qualified for free and reduced lunch across their schools in their district. And what you can see is, it's kind of hard to see because it's a little small, but the different schools are represented by the pie graphs. And within the pie graphs, it shows you the percentage of students who qualified for free and reduced lunch in gray. And now if we flip forward, so pay attention here, we're going to 2011. If we flip forward, this is the way in which the boundaries change. So you see some geographic boundaries change, and you see the spread of students with free and reduced lunch at each of these schools is now all within 2 percentage points of one another. So between 19% and 21%. Similar efforts were done in Wake County on a much larger scale about a decade ago. Those were later dismantled. But Wake County essentially said, look, we don't want any of our schools in our district to have more than 45% of our students qualifying for free and reduced lunch, because we know about the research around the effects of concentrated poverty in specific schools. So that's one method. Another that's been tried all over the country is adding diversity-oriented magnet schools or charter schools. So, there's two different ways to go about this. Historically, Charlotte-Mecklenburg has had a really robust and has a long tradition of magnet schools, as does Wake County right up the road in North Carolina. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think folks are quite familiar with the concept of magnet schools, but a key question that was brought up all throughout the morning is the method of admissions to magnet schools, because historically magnet schools have been intended to promote integration, but there are ways in which if the admissions method is not done properly, they actually do just the opposite. And then of course there are charter schools that have deemed themselves diverse by design, and they've been created specifically to draw a diverse subset of students across socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. But it's important to note this is not all charter schools, far from it. There are a lot of charter schools that see themselves as only serving certain populations, and those would not be seen to be increasing integration. District-wide equitable choice. So there are few, but there are some districts across the country, such as in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they have a district-wide choice algorithm where folks can rank where they want to send their children, but the algorithm accounts for racial and socioeconomic makeup of students in different schools across the district, and make sure there's an equitable distribution. So there's an element of choice in that system, but there's also an element to make sure that there's equitable distribution of students, so that all of the schools in Cambridge Public Schools have a certain fall within a certain set of racial and socioeconomic diversity metrics. Then there's also interdistrict choice. I know on the call this morning, on the presentation this morning, Hartford was mentioned. So interdistrict remedies are some of the most effective remedies if you can actually get the buy-in to do them. As we talked about before, the Milliken v. Bradley case prevented courts from mandating interdistrict transfer programs, but in places where they are voluntary and they happen, they can be extremely effective because the segregation between districts in many parts of the country is as bad, if not worse, than segregation within districts. And so Hartford gives a good example of interdistrict choice. And then Angie, I told you I was going to give you a shout out here. So there's also some really innovative things happening all across the country in terms of people being both really specific about where they site new schools and I know, and Angie, you all call them transformation schools in Dallas ISD, but being very specific about how you enroll students and how you create new schools that are desirable for folks from across the economic spectrum. And I think, and Angie, if you can jump in here at the end of the conversation, I would love to hear, but preliminarily, I've heard that some of these schools are some of the most popular schools that exist in Dallas ISD, and they are some of the most diverse. And so there's a lot of promising practices around being very specific about where schools are sited, but also creating new schools that have broad appeal and are very specific about how they enroll students as well. I saved this part of the Gallup poll till after I talked about the remedies, because it's important to know, well, how do people feel about some of these different remedies? So Gallup also surveyed folks on this and wanted to know what percentage of Americans favor versus oppose some of these different remedies. As you can see, magnet schools are at the top of the list. 79% of people favor using magnet schools to make schools more integrated. Housing is an interesting lever. So it's the second most popular at 66%. Redrawing school boundaries, amazingly, in my opinion, amazingly gets 60%, because I know that anytime you raise that issue in districts across the country, that's when you get folks out to the meetings and folks feel really passionate about that. And then busing, no surprise here, is at 43% of people. Maybe it's a surprise that even that many Americans approve of busing. But again, I want to make sure folks understand it's because of the historical connotations of busing, more so, in my opinion, than the actual transportation of students in order to achieve this goal. So very quickly to close, and then we're going to open this up. Considerations for moving forward. I could only touch on a couple things in this very brief presentation. I already hear myself talking at 1,000,000 miles per minute because I wanted to make sure I didn't leave things out. But I think there's a lot of things that we need to consider here. Public opinion is a huge one. Okay, what are the messages that resonate with Americans? What are the ways that we can sort of unencumber people from some of the historical connotations of the way that desegregation, which quite frankly went poorly in many parts of the country in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So there's a lot of work to be done to regaining people's trust in how this should go. The political context is huge, but it's important for folks not just to focus on the federal level, state, and we all know education is local. 90% of dollars for education comes from state and states and LEAs. And so we have to make sure we pay attention to the politics that are local, not just federal. Exposure, it is so important for folks, ordinary, everyday parents and students, to be exposed to exemplars of schools that are diverse, that are doing what we say, touting some of the results that we show in the research can accrue to students who attend these types of schools. I can't tell you how many folks I come in contact who wouldn't be able to name a single school that is diverse and successful because they just haven't seen it. They haven't been exposed to it. Equity and inclusion. So, there are a lot of ways that desegregation was done poorly historically. It's really important that we consider questions around equity and how students are treated within schools as we undertake different ways of doing integration. I can talk more about that in a second. And then housing, of course. The nexus of housing policy and education policy. Folks operate in silos, and there are great people both in the housing world and the education world who just don't talk to each other enough to think about ways that we can proactively plan, particularly in our urban and our suburban areas, plan for housing and educate and schools to both be beautifully diverse, inclusive communities. And then finally, some of the policy solutions that we talked about before. But you see this at the bottom of my list. There's so many other things we need to talk about in addition to just the policy solutions. We can have great ideas, but folks have to be bought in, and that political context has to be right. And so many other things have to be right in order for us to be successful in this space. Now is my turn for me to shut up. But I'm going to open it up both for questions and discussion. I think we have a good amount of people to be able to have a discussion. So let me just pause there and see if anyone wants to get in with either a question or anything that I talked about that resonated with you or that you wanted to expound on. So I'm going to stop here and feel free to jump in. I didn't realize my group was so shy. I certainly, as a former teacher, know how to call on people, and I'd be happy to. Angie, I see you unmuted. Do you have something to say?
Well, I wasn't going to jump in. I thought everybody else was going to jump in. Since we got a shout out, I was going to let everyone else talk. No, thank you, Stefan. This was great information. I love the context, always starting with your grandfather. That puts the why in what you do. Where do you see, go back to your slide you just had, your last one, 22. The one where you said, yes. So when we look at all of these pieces, what other districts do you think are moving? I know you gave a couple of different examples, but where would you say some districts that have done a lot more work with the housing side?
Yeah, great question, Angie. And sadly, the answer is that I don't have a ton that I can just rattle off. So Angie, as you know, and I want to talk a little bit about this, at the Century Foundation, we are starting a really exciting new initiative called the Bridges Collaborative, which is going to bring together 50 organizations from across the country, including school districts and housing organizations. And part of the effort is to actually address this specific issue, Angie, which is that there are very few examples of places across the country where both of these branches of, they're not branches, arms of government are thinking proactively and working proactively to create schools that are diverse, integrated, and inclusive. I have a friend of mine who works in Montgomery, who has studied Montgomery County, Heather Schwartz, and that's probably one of the closest examples of a place where you have a housing authority that is very proactive about thinking about how to make housing diverse and integrated. And you've got a school system that is maybe lags a little bit behind, but they're entertaining a boundary analysis right now. So you've got two organizations that I think are ripe for potential collaboration, but I don't know how much actual collaboration happens between those organizations. But I would love to hear if other people have good examples of this from across the country, but I don't have a laundry list. Jody, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah.
I was going to share two separate statements, one which we have just about 2 minutes left. But I thought that Michelle Watts brought in a really interesting addition to that conversation around housing, which is what we're going to see and what we're expecting in terms of higher eviction rates due to the economic downturn. So I'm sure you have the solution to that right now, but I think it's going to become like a subcategory under your housing all of its own, I fear. I don't know if you have 2 minutes worth of response for that or.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we need to pay attention more broadly to demographic changes, period, between urban and suburban areas, which suburban areas look very different than they did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and the forces of gentrification. And I think, as you're alluding to, what is going to happen as folks, due to the COVID crisis, are being evicted. So that, to me, there is the very human, the very human crisis of we need to make sure people have places to live. Mm-hmm. And then, in addition to that, as we are doing that, let's be smart about how that relates to prospects for opportunity, where people live, where their children attend school, so forth and so on. I know we have Go ahead. Mhm.
No, I think unfortunately it does present an opportunity to try and solve a much bigger problem, for sure. I greatly appreciate the work you put into this, Dr. Lallinger. It was fascinating. Really nice summary. Great context. I do think any minute now we're all going to operate back into the main room.
Well, Frank, let me give you the last word before we disappear here.
Well, the problem is my question's about the size of the rest of the afternoon instead of the rest of this minute. It seems to me the issues entail all kinds of things other than education. And it has to do with how the schools fit into the urban context. And all these things are all interconnected with each other. And we're not about to make any progress on solving any of this until we look at that larger context. I mean, I like this list that's here, but it seems like we need more people sitting at the table talking about this at the same time.
That's absolutely right. And that's one of the big pushes that I always make, is that the problem is larger than schools alone can solve. However, in the same breath, I also say that doesn't mean schools and school districts can just sort of abdicate their responsibility and throw their hands up, because there are a lot of things that schools and school districts can do. We won't be able to solve the whole problem.